Let me talk about historiography for a few minutes. Watch the clock here. Either in the ancient world or in the present world, when you talk in terms of historiography or philosophy of history, there are certain criteria that you want to be able to fulfill, or at least as many as possible when you start looking for data, when you start talking about historical evidence for any kind of event. And in present times as well as in the past, scholars want to find, just to give you two out of about 10 criteria, scholars want to find sources that are early in eyewitness. Those are two. Now, you don't always have that in the ancient world. In fact, sometimes in the ancient world you get some pretty bad sources and some pretty large gaps. A couple examples I've been using this week would be, say, Alexander the Great. The sources for Alexander, we have about 5 contemporary sources from Alexander's time, but none that were written, but none are extant today. The sources that we do have on Alexander, they're all about 300 to 450 years after Alexander. The two best sources are Plutarch and Arrian, and they're both about 425 to 450 years. So if Alexander dies approximately 330 BC, these sources are coming in at about 115 or 120 AD, for a total of 420 years anyway. Okay, now that's kind of a rough gap. It's a long gap. But when you come down to Jesus, we have a number of New Testament sources, a number of Christian sources outside the New Testament that are very early, number of non-Christian sources. Actually, there's 12 sources for Jesus outside the New Testament. And they're all within a frame of time which is, decent or longer, depending on what source you have and how long the gap is. So if you compare Jesus to somebody like say, Tiberius Caesar, who is on the throne the same time Jesus lives. He lives just a few years after Jesus. We have 4 major sources for Tiberius. Now, some people think, oh, well, we've got 4 major sources for Jesus, the Gospel. So they compare data. Now, our earliest source for Tiberius, did I just go off? No? Okay, sorry, I'm getting paranoid. The earliest source for Tiberius is contemporary with Tiberius. That's excellent to have a contemporary source. The issue is that it's the least helpful of the sources. The best source for Tiberius is Tacitus at about plus 80 years later. Now, the earliest of the Gospels, I'll do it down here. I'm going to be walking off a timeline tonight. So I'm going to use this as let's call this ground zero, or the death of Jesus. I say ground zero because we don't know exactly what year it is. Scholars who choose most frequently say about 30 AD. 30 is pretty popular. Second most popular year is about 33. You have to get the full moon right and that kind of stuff, because they know about what time of the year it is, Passover, and so on. So I'm just going to say ground zero. And a lot of Christians will say, well, our best sources for the Gospels are, and I'm going to use critical dates here, Mark at about plus 40, Matthew at about plus 50, Luke at about 55, Acts at maybe 60, now obviously 60 plus 30, about 90 AD, and John at about 95 AD. So John is the latest of the sources, and he's about 65 years afterwards. By any chance, is there any tape? This is just flipping all around. If not, I'll just keep twisting it and hoping it works. But Sometimes when you speak, folks have tape that hold these things on, but if you don't, that's okay. How about glue? Okay. So the sources for Jesus will go from approximately plus 40 to about plus 65. Now, these are New Testament sources. We have other sources in here, non-Christian, Christian sources, and so on. Now, on the same scale, Tiberius is about the same time as Jesus. The earliest source is contemporary, but it's the least helpful. And the best source for Tiberius is Tacitus, prominent Roman historian. And Tacitus is about plus 80. So the best source for Tacitus is 15 years further removed than the latest source for Jesus, of these, if you use these sources. The next best source for Tiberius is Suetonius at plus 85. And the fourth one is Diocasius at about plus 180. So the sources for Tiberius are later and not to be compared year-wise to the Gospels. But some people say, well, the material with the Gospels can't rank with Roman historiography because the Roman sources are historical, New Testament sources are religious propaganda, so you can't compare religious to historical. Up until just recently, as in a few decades ago, it was pretty commonly taught that the Christian Gospels should not be called biographies. And if you were to say, well, what kind of genre are they? A lot of people would say, I don't know, it's sort of it's got some characteristics of biographies, but it's not really a biography. And that's just where people left it. They'd say, I don't know, do you have something there? Okay. So you might say, well, okay, what about the Gospels? But about 1990, Gospel criticism took a turn because of the work of a classical scholar at the University of London named Richard Burridge. And he did a very detailed comparison of classical, what are called Greco-Roman biographies, with the characteristics of the Gospels. And he concluded that while there are differences between the Gospels and bio, there are differences between the bio and bio. There's no hard and fast rule. But in so many different categories, he showed that the Gospels are very similar to Greco-Roman biographies. Well, as always happens, scholarship starts checking you out on that. And the verdict was that Burridge was probably correct, and that the Christian Gospels should be called Greco-Roman biographies. They follow that line. And so as genre, they are this most recognized form of genre, according to most of the historians or others who study this material. But then there's still the question of how come the New Testament records miracles? And I guess the idea is the New Testament records miracles, and somebody might be thinking Greco-Roman bio don't include miracles, so the history is history and the New Testament's religious. But virtually every Greco-Roman bio records miracles. That's the way they wrote. And there's very few exceptions. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides is one of the only ancient Greek or Roman writers who didn't record miracles. Even Herodotus, so-called father of history in Greece, had miraculous claims. Tacitus does, although Tacitus has less than Suetonius. Livy, the great, maybe second only to Tacitus in the Roman Empire, Livy wrote his History of Rome, and he starts by telling the story of Romulus and Remus, the two boys raised by the two babies raised by wolves, and that's on the Tiber River, and pretty soon we get the city of Rome. Not just the story about the two boys and the wolves, but it's also hundreds of years before his earliest sources. So we have issues with being a long time, no eyewitness, kind of a fantastic story. And that kind of is status quo in the ancient world. So you don't really disqualify yourself by telling fantastic tales, or you don't really disqualify yourself genre-wise, since they're close enough. But people will say, well, okay, we can overlook some of these supernatural sorts of claims, but we would like there to be some data. You know, what do you have in the ancient world? So the question I'm asking tonight is, what would a case be like according to these ancient claims? A lot of people are going to say, well, I'd say probably the average Christian who tries to argue this way is going to say, so our best sources for the resurrection might be Mark, in this order, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and John. And they'll put it out there and they'll say, you know, it meets the criteria, it's closer to the sources than other ancient works are, which are well recognized. Yes, there are supernatural claims. You're going to get supernatural claims in all of this material pretty much. And so, do we have any good data for this? All right, hold that for a moment. That's a look at ancient historiography and ancient sources. I'm not going to be saying it too much. If you folks want to pursue this during Q&A, that's fine. But I'm not going to be saying too much about the non-Christian sources, about 12.5 non-Christian sources for Jesus, every one non-Christian. And they record some pretty extraordinary things. You might be surprised, because some people assume, well, these non-Christian sources, some major historians. I mean, we have people, now sometimes a statement, it's a one-liner, or it's a paragraph, or 2 one-liners, or paragraph here and a one-line over here. But you have folks like Thales, an ancient, well, he did a Mediterranean history very early, about 52 AD, which would put him at about 22 years after Jesus' death. Thales, you've got Tacitus, some names I've already mentioned, Tacitus, Suetonius, 2 Roman historians, Josephus, the Jewish historian, who also the Jews didn't appreciate him terribly much because he became sort of a turncoat and became a Roman historian and even moved to Rome and served Caesar and so on. But Josephus tells us some important things. Lucian, the satirist who makes fun of Christianity. I mean, these sources aren't pro-Christian. But Lucian is also, interestingly enough, the only ancient who gives us a philosophy of history, historiography, how to do history. And he differentiates between eyewitness and non-eyewitness sources and why it's so important to get somebody who's early and there. Eyewitness is always good. An early eyewitness is better than a late eyewitness. Sometimes the late eyewitness could be your best source. But I mean, all things considered, you're looking for early eyewitness data. All right. Let me turn to the New Testament a little bit. One of the strangest things that that folks don't often understand is if you go to Western universities with departments of religion or philosophy or whatever, and you say, well, I'm going to use this New Testament book or that New Testament book or this New Testament text or that particular text, you might think that people would say, yeah, it's propaganda, it's Christian, and you can't let Christians speak for, you know, but they don't do that. And not if you use accredited text, not if you use accredited verses. We can respond to that if you want, but what happens is historians use what they call criteria, and criteria are rules. They're used in history, and then they're moved over to New Testament studies. They're rules for allowing how you can tell an ancient historical text from a non-historical text. It's about 10 rules, and they apply them. You know, this kind of a text is better than this kind of a text. This kind of an author is better than this kind of a, you know, an enemy is better than a friend. Somebody who has nothing to gain is better than somebody who has something to gain. Somebody who's telling something embarrassing is better than somebody who's telling something with which they totally agree and makes them look good. Things like that. And those and other rules. Let's call it the 2 heads are better than 1 rule, which is simply multiple sources. If you have 2 sources, it's better than 1. If you have 4, that's better than 1 or 2. And many of the New Testament criteria, they meet these. In fact, today, in the scholarly community, now I'm not talking about people on websites that just kind of sound off and say whatever they want and don't have degrees in relevant fields, don't have peer-reviewed publications, don't have terminal degrees. They just kind of sound off. People can say anything they want. But if you go to the scholars who deal with this material day in and day out, it makes no difference how far to the left you go, how liberal you are, how far you go to the right, how conservative you are, how, moderate or in the middle or whatever. But they will allow certain texts. And by far the critics' darling in the West, let's say Western Europe, UK, North America, Australia, by far the critics' darling is the Apostle Paul. They like Paul. And there are 13 books that bear Paul's name in the New Testament. And critics, as long as they're scholars, not just somebody who decides to sound off on a blog or something, but as long as they're scholars, no matter how far to the left you go, they're going to allow 6 to 8 of Paul's epistles. They're called, in the literature, they're called the authentic Pauline epistles. And there's almost total agreement on which books those are. And those would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. Now some, like G.A. Wells, a well-known British skeptic, now he's a little out of his area, he's a professor of German, but he's one of the guys who questions whether Jesus ever lived. And he's, as I'll give you an example in a minute, he's written off by the scholarly community. And you say, well, that's because they're Christians. Well, no, as I'll show you in a minute, that's not why. But G.A. Wells will give you all 7 of those books I just mentioned, even though he's a skeptic and really questions this. He's going to throw Colossians in there too. So he's going to give you 8 of the 13 books. Now, what do I mean when I say they'll grant you 6 to 8 of Paul's books? It doesn't mean they think Paul's inspired. It doesn't mean that they think whatever he writes, it's true automatically. It just means he was well trained. He was a scholar. He was a Pharisee, so he learned, you read Josephus, and the Pharisees go through a procedure of learning how to pass on tradition so that you learn from who learns from who learns from, and you pass on tradition. So Paul was a sharp person who'd done some key studying. He was an enemy who became a believer. He said he met the risen Jesus. And he's authoritative in the sense that he's not going to lie just to flat out. What I'm saying, the scholars don't think he's lied or he would make something up. He could be wrong, but he's authoritative in the sense of being the right guy at the right time, asking the right questions, and he knew some of the other eyewitnesses. So that's why critics will go to Paul before they'll look at the Gospels. This means these are coming back, and I can give you sources if you want to know. But most people will go for Paul. For example, one of the best-known critics of Christianity in America, his name's Michael Martin. He's an atheist philosopher. He wrote a book called The Case Against Christianity. And in that book he says, the only eyewitness of a resurrection appearance that we have is that of the Apostle Paul. So now when someone says that, you have a choice. Do you want to go to some of the Gospels or do you want to take Paul's material? And I'm going to take the second route tonight. Instead of using these books, I think these books can work fine, but I'm going to use Paul's criteria tonight. So let me introduce a couple texts to you. I'm only going to use 2 texts, both from accepted Pauline epistles, as I will illustrate with this following example. I was lecturing in a British college the other night, and one of the professors sent me a YouTube interview of probably the best-known skeptic in America. You probably know his name here. How many of you know who Bart Ehrman is? Okay, good many of you. Bart Ehrman's a very well-known critic. Almost all his books are published by Oxford University Press. He's an agnostic, not a Christian. And they sent me this clip where he goes on one of these skeptic radio programs, and the skeptic's one of these kind of guys who's out of his area and just kind of goes off on everything. But Bart Ehrman's got a PhD from Princeton Seminary and a very well-known skeptic. And so the guy tries kind of pushing him a little bit. And he says, now, this is the skeptic who's this other kind of skeptic without training, and he says, now I hear you're pretty skeptical, and he said, we really appreciate that. He said, so now what are you going to say about those of us who believe Jesus never lived? And Bart Ehrman kind of chuckles, and he says, yeah, well, I'd never say that. And the guy said, why not? And Bart Ehrman said, well, I don't know a single historian in the entire world who thinks that Jesus never lived. And the guy said, well, can't you say this and can't you say that? And Bart Ehrman says, no, you can't say that. He said, it's just not the way the data works. And the guy says, well, I just think we can't take Christians at their word and we can't use New Testament sources. And Bart laughs again. He goes, look, man, I'm not a Christian. He said, I'm not a Christian, I'm a skeptic. But he says, that's not the way history works. People can report things, even if they're close to it or not close, like it or don't like it, but they can still report things, and we have the ability to get in there and judge whether they're, according to probability, if they're speaking truthfully or not. And so he keeps trying to push Bart Ehrman, and Bart keeps saying, you can't say that. There are no reputable historians that take your view, none. And the guy said, well, how about the New Testament books? You can't use New Testament books, can you? And Bart Ehrman laughs again, and he says, yeah, you can. You can use the New Testament books. You have to treat them critically. You just don't accept them at face value. But he said, take, for example, the epistles of Paul. And the guy said, how about the book of Galatians? And Bart Ehrman says, there's not a guy in the world, there's not a scholar in the world who won't allow you to use the book of Galatians. In fact, if the Christians don't use it first, the skeptics will pull it out. They'll talk about the same data. So it was a very interesting interview. I'm going to use two books tonight. One of the ones that Bart just said everybody in the world accepts, it's the book of Galatians, and 1 Corinthians. They're the two texts I'm going to use, and just a few verses from both. And I want to evaluate this so you can kind of, put your thinking caps on, and I invite you to think through this with me tonight. I went through a time where I was, I didn't know what could be believed about Christianity. I was very close to becoming a Buddhist. And in fact, I used to argue with Christians, by the way. I used to debate Christians in college. And I just didn't know if there's any basis for this stuff. So someone said, check out the resurrection. So I did. And here's what I found. Okay, first two verses in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, he says, when I came to you, Corinthians, he said, I preached the gospel to you. And he said, depending on what you did with it, depending whether you believe it or not, depends on whether or not you're a believer. That's pretty simple, straightforward. You say, well, what's the gospel? Well, whenever Paul defines the gospel, and Paul's definitions would be in his epistles, the other place you can find definitions is in the book of Acts, where some of the early preaching went out. And these three beliefs are always present when the gospel is defined. There's always the belief that Jesus is deity, his death, his resurrection. Those three are always present. Now, sometimes other things come in. A couple times you see buried, once born of a woman. And that's the contrast in Christianity between Son of God, human being. But they're not there all the time. Always present, deity of Christ, death, resurrection. Paul says, that's what I said when I came. I preached that to you. So let me go back down here. I'm going to start giving you a new scale. This is ground zero again. But instead of going down here to Mark and working this way, I'm going to start with Paul's epistles. Doesn't make any difference if you're liberal or conservative, believer or non-believer. Everybody puts 1 Corinthians at the same time. It's approximately 55 AD, give or take a year or two. And a believer is just as likely to make it later or earlier than an unbeliever is. But 1 Corinthians 15 is one of the best established books of the first century. In fact, one of the reasons it's well established is because the text tells us that when Paul came to Corinth, we're told that when Paul came to Corinth, there was a man named Erastus who was one of the city administrators. And from an ancient archaeological, from a notice carved into rock, we read about Erastus, the position he had, New Testament's right, and his date is very well known because these positions were one-year appointments. So Erastus comes to power in Corinth from 51 to 52 AD. So Paul says, this is the gospel I gave you. So basically what he's saying is, I talked to you about the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. I talked to you when I came, 51, 52, but he was writing it here. So he wrote it here, reminding them that he spoke it here. This is the message he gave. And he said in 1 Corinthians 15:3, he says, I gave you what I was given. He says to the Corinthians, I passed on to you what was given to me as of first importance. In other words, the central message that I had for you, I passed on just as others gave it to me. And that's when he says, Christ, which is a title, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And he gives a list of appearances, first to Peter, then to a group called the 12. And in this list that comes here, he's got, there's actually 2 individuals and 3 groups, and then he appends his own name on the end. So that makes 3 individuals and 3 groups. So the individuals are Peter, James, the brother of Jesus. Paul adds his name at the end. He says, last of all, he appeared to me. And 3 groups, a group called the 12, a group called all the apostles, and a group of 500 brothers at one time. Reason I emphasize that is depending on how you count it, a lot of people think that they were given a male count only, the significance being that group could have been much more than 500. Could have been a lot larger group. Hard to say. But that's just the lineup here. Okay, Paul wrote it. Paul spoke it. Where, from whom, and when did he receive this material? The critical consensus. Now, these are critical scholars, terminal degrees, peer-reviewed publications. Most of them are just going to talk about the text without believing any kind of inspiration or anything like that. And they believe that Paul received this material about 35 AD, or plus 5. Now, if you believe that Jesus died in 33 AD, this material would be 38, but the plus 5 would remain the same. You go, well, how in the world do we know that? How do we know it's plus 5? That's because they believe Paul to be a reliable source. He could be wrong. We're not talking inspiration here for these guys. But they think Paul speaks reliably. He studied. He knows, the world of scholarship and how to pass tradition on. In fact, I told the group today that Antony Flew, the famous British, when he made this comment, he was an atheist. He probably wrote more pro-atheist literature than anybody in history. And Antony Flew says, Paul is a first-rate philosophical mind, and Jesus was a first-rate moral philosopher. That's a pretty good compliment for an atheist philosopher to call Paul a first-rate philosophical mind, Jesus a first-rate moral philosopher. But I'm just saying Paul was in the right place, knew how to do research, and he got this stuff about here. You say, well, okay, tell me how you got that. Okay, let's go back to crucifixion. And when did Paul claim to have his experience on the way to Damascus? When did this happen? That's like asking how late after Acts 1 is Acts 9? And Paul's conversion is usually put, an early date would be plus 1, an average date would be plus 2 or plus 3, and kind of a late date would be plus 4. So an average date for Paul's conversion would be plus 2 or plus 3. So you put Paul's conversion about here, and then in Galatians chapter 1, the other text, Paul says, he said, I met Jesus on the way to Damascus. And he said, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. I didn't need to go to them. I was given the message from the Lord himself. He said, but 3 years later, I did go up there and met with a couple of the apostles. He says, I stayed 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. All right. So again, Paul's conversion, average, pretty clear. And again, this is not, there's no significance whether you're a believer, unbeliever, historian, non-Christian. The dates put it about +2, +3. 3 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem, +2, +3, about +5. So he's in Jerusalem with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. And as a New Testament scholar of the last generation, Cambridge University scholar C.H. Dodd, New Testament scholar, says, he said, Paul spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and it's safe to say that they did more than talk about the weather. What did they talk about? Well, this is the book of Galatians, and the theme of the book of Galatians is the gospel. It's not a real long book, and Paul's talking about, something like this. I think the theme of Galatians would be, it's about the gospel, get it right, don't get too little, don't get too much, don't overdo it. You're starting in the Spirit, don't go to good works, just be sure you know what the gospel is. That's the theme of Galatians. So how in the world could he go there and talk to Peter and James and not talk about the center of the Christian faith, which I said is defined several times in the New Testament, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. So Paul goes, spends 15 days. I know what I would ask if I were Paul. Like I said, I had all these questions for about 10 or 12 years. My big question if I were Paul would be, hey, I'll tell you what I saw on the way to Damascus if you'll tell me what you saw after Jesus died. Let's just compare some notes here. Let's talk about the gospel. Well, just a few verses later, there's no divisions in the original text. We put chapters and verses in there so that we can find them, in church and all read the same thing. But the end of Galatians 1 goes right into Galatians 2. Before it does that, this meeting right here at about +5, maybe +6, after ground zero, there's a little Greek word in the text. Well, I always say it's a little Greek word. The root word is short. The word itself is longer. Hysteresai. Hysteresai. The root word is histor, H-I-S-T-O-R. It's the Greek word from which we get our word history. And in the ancient world, hysteresai, the root word histor, was used of a person who gets first close-up eyewitness data. In our news today, you get big news from here or there around the world, and you're looking at your television. We were watching the BBC the other night, and on-the-field reporting. The reporters in this country, reporters in that country, you can check it out yourself. Hysteresai, in the ancient papyri, is used of someone who goes and checks something out. One of the examples is they checked out a river. And instead of asking people what this river looks like, the fellow went down the river himself, and he said, here's the white water, here's some rocks, pretty treacherous here, here's a cliff face, here's a small town, gets pretty shallow here, gets deeper and things get smoother right in here. And he tracked the river himself. That's hysteresai. That's going and checking things out. And Paul says, I went to Jerusalem, I spent time with Peter and James, and I inquired of them, I researched, I asked them, and the subject matter has to do with the gospel. Just a few verses later then, Paul says, 14 years later, critics put this at about 48 AD, doesn't make any difference if you're conservative or liberal or in between, the dates, it's dated about the same. About 48 AD, which is +18, Paul says, I went back up to Jerusalem, Galatians chapter 2, verse 2. He said, I set the gospel sort of on the table. I set the gospel before them to see if we were all on the same page. I want to make sure we were speaking about the same topic. And he said, I'm checking this out with them. The other apostles were there, and he gives names. He says, Peter, second time he's been with Peter at least. James, the brother of Jesus, second time he's been with James, minimum. John, this is John the son of Zebedee, the fisherman, and Paul. Now certainly, without any question, these are the four most influential Christians in the early church. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to name one Christian who was more influential, better known, more authoritative than Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, John, and Paul. He's there with them at about 48 AD, and he says, I checked out the gospel, want to make sure we're preaching the same message, make sure we're all on the same page. And he says 5 little words in English. He says, they added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. We agreed. We're on the same page. And then just a few verses later, Galatians chapter 2, verse 9, the text says that they said to him, Paul's going to take this message to the Gentiles, and Peter should take this material to the Jews. But the message is the same. Paul said, we're all on the same page, and that's the end of the meeting. So again, what we have here, I mean, if you'd said to Paul, this is a long time before you go up there and have this powwow with these guys. It's a long time before you check out the message. And I think Paul would say, you know, you're really not following my message here, my argument real well. I told you I got it from Jesus, let's say, +5. Sorry, I got it from Jesus about +3. Okay, second step, I checked it out with Peter and James about +5. I checked it out with Peter, James, and John at +18 total, 14 years later. And so this is the kind of thing critics like about Paul. He's in the right place, right time. Doesn't mean he's, you know, got to be absolutely flawless. But when he's given the report, he's tracking with these things. He's following the report, word hysteresi, and he's checking his sources. All right. Now, this part's important. Paul gets this material about 35 AD. About 35 AD. But this is when Paul heard their account. Paul knew his account, right? Paul knew that on the way to Damascus. But here Paul talks to them. And the text in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, it is virtually unanimously, no matter how far to the left you are, no matter how far to the right you are, it's pretty much unanimously put at 5 or 6 years after the cross. In fact, Richard Bauckham of Cambridge University says that's a consensus reading from critical scholars. A consensus dating is about 5 or 6 years after the cross. But that's when Paul heard their report. See, if he got it from Peter and James, they had the report before he got it. And it takes a while. 1 Corinthians, this will take a long time to explain, but I'll be glad to go into it during the Q&A if you want. In the New Testament text, there's dozens of little tiny snippets of text that actually predate the text to which it occurred. And they're passing on tradition, which they can tell linguistically is earlier material. This is one of them, and that's where 1 Corinthians 15, that's one reason they think it's so early, besides the fact that he was here for this meeting. Okay, Paul gets it from them. They have it before he does. It takes a while to put this text into the stylized form. It's like you got words for a song, and now you're going to write the music. You know, you might do it quickly. It might drag out, you know, over a year or something. But at any rate, it takes a while to put it in that form, and here we are, right at the event in question, the crucifixion and whatever happened afterwards. So once again, this is when Paul heard their story. They had their story before Paul had it, obviously. It takes a while to standardize the text, and we're right here on top of it. You say, well, I don't know, this sounds pretty conservative. This sounds like Christians would really, like, you know, hope this is true. Do skeptics agree with this kind of stuff? And actually they do, very much. I'll give you a couple examples. Let's take a German New Testament scholar, sometimes called an atheist. I do not know if he's an atheist, some kind of skeptic. His name is Gerrit Ludemann. And Ludemann says that the latest this material could have been standardized. It's not the date of the material, but the latest date it could be standardized is +3. He's a skeptic, perhaps an atheist. I'm just not personally sure, so I don't, want to label him. But he's very skeptical. and he places this at the latest at +3. Another group you may have heard about, largely Americans, but a British version of it just started. They're called the Jesus Seminar, and they're the folks that throw the beads in the hat. How many of you heard of the Jesus Seminar? Okay, good number. Thanks. When they throw these beads in the hat, the red bead means the saying is authentic. There aren't very many authentic sayings from the Gospels, according to these guys. Probably authentic is pink. Probably not authentic is gray. And no way is black. Okay, so red is yes, pink is probably, gray is probably not, and black is not. They reject 80 to 90% of the so-called red letter words of Jesus in the Gospels. They reject 80 to 90%. And yet, they date this material from Paul. They say it dates, the standardizing of it, dates from before Paul's conversion. So if here's the cross, here's Paul's conversion, maybe here. This dates from in here. That's a Jesus Seminar, very skeptical. The latest material on this comes from 3 scholars that have worked in Britain for a long time. James D.G. Dunn, who just recently retired from University of Durham. Larry Hurtado, recently retired from Edinburgh University in Scotland. And Richard Bauckham, who recently retired from St. Andrews up in Scotland, but then he took up a post down in Cambridge University. And they argue that in 30 AD, as you come out of the gate, as you're starting to look down toward the first 25 years of Christianity, they argue that 3 doctrines were there in the very beginning. And actually, at least 2 of the 3 changed their mind. I'll tell you about that later if you're interested during the Q&A, but they changed their position. They held another position earlier, but they've since changed from the evidence. And they said that in the beginning, working from the crucifixion and working down this way, at the beginning you have to have 3 beliefs. What's called the high Christology. That means a deity of Christ. Okay, what do you mean by high Christology? That means not just nice things about Jesus, but very laudatory things, such that Hurtado has written a 500-page book arguing, with one of the most influential publishers, arguing that the earliest Christians coming right out at the gate here, they worship Jesus at a very early date. Now, these are monotheistic, law-abiding Jews, and they're going to worship Jesus. Richard Bauckham argues that the same group took Old Testament verses with the name of Jehovah and other very prominent names of deity and applied them to Jesus at a very early date, in the 30s AD. So here at the beginning, you have Jesus who's worshipped, Jesus who's applied terms applying only to Jehovah, and then these same folks think that you get a resurrection too. And you say, well, are these guys really well received? These 3 folks are as influential as anybody in historical Jesus studies today. A lot of skeptics. It almost doesn't matter whether you're a skeptic or not. There's just a lot of consensus on this. So my point is, you can accept the material that largely critics allow. So let's say it this way. If you took a view over here of the New Testament, and you said, I think the New Testament's an inspired book. It's inspired by God. Well then, if you really think it's inspired, you're going to think Jesus was raised from the dead. Okay. Another group of people might say it's not inspired, but it's a fairly reliable book. I mean, Greco-Roman bio. We have some data for eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels. A really good book to check out on that is Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Almost 500 pages. Very good argument. Okay, so you could say, well, it's not inspired, but it's very reliable. Okay, if you think the New Testament's reliable, probably Jesus is raised from the dead. You go, well, yeah, but what if I don't like one of those 2 views? What if I don't like the view that says the New Testament's inspired? What if I don't like the view that says the Bible's reliable? What if I say the Bible is just a book of ancient literature? I mean, it's at least an old book with words on a page from a very long time ago. Okay, what if I hold that? What if I hold finding facts in the Bible is like trying to find facts in Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey? I don't find a lot there, but there's some things there. There may have been a Trojan horse. There may have been a war with Troy, and so on. What would that look like? When I'm arguing, and what I argued in my doctoral dissertation at a secular school, guys in my committee, number, I don't know the exact number, but several of them didn't even believe in the resurrection. I mean, I should say the minority would have accepted the resurrection. But what I did was argue, even if you take the skeptical view of the New Testament, the one that says it's not inspired, it's not reliable, it's just a book of ancient literature, you still have enough of a basis to argue that the resurrection is the best explanation of these facts. Someone says, well, you know, that's ridiculous because you're talking about a supernatural event. Well, then what you need to do is come up with a naturalistic theory and fill in the blank. Now, this is not a naturalistic theory. No way, resurrection's crazy, supernatural events don't happen, silliness. Okay, that's not a naturalistic theory, that's a denial. That would be like a Christian saying, no, the resurrection is true, it's the center of my faith, greatest thing that's ever happened, my eternal salvation is based on that. Well, that's not a theory either, that's an affirmation of belief, just like the other one's an affirmation of unbelief. But a naturalistic theory would go like this. Jesus has not been raised from the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank. And you need to fill in the blank. You need to come up with something. Otherwise, it's just your statement that you don't think it's true. Well, critics have tried to fill in the blank. Critics have done it for a long time. The heyday of naturalistic theories was 19th century German liberalism, so-called. 19th century German liberalism from Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1799, up until World War I. That's when these efforts were most populous. Today, things have happened a lot more, have changed a lot more. And the vast majority of scholars who write today, you might find this very strange, but the majority of scholars believe that something happened to Jesus after his death, in the sense he was seen somehow. I'll give you an example. A scholar who used to teach at Oxford University, then he went to Duke University in our country, calls himself a liberal. His name's E.P. Sanders, very well known in U.S. and England. And he wrote a book called The Human Figure of Jesus. He's written some very, very influential, sort of changing the whole course of contemporary criticism. But one of his books is called The Human Figure of Jesus. He gives us a list of what everybody agrees, not what he thinks is true, because that would just be a statement about himself. And again, he calls himself liberal. But he gives a list of where scholars are, what facts they have in common. And when he gets to the end of Jesus' life, he says, this is one of his facts, which he says is a given among contemporary scholars, and again, specialists in the field. He says, after his death, Jesus was seen. Exactly how he was seen, I'm not totally positive. But he says that more than once. After his death, Jesus appeared to his followers. That's the way he says it. After his death, Jesus appeared to his followers. I'm not saying that's one more guy who believes this. I'm saying that he says that that is a predominant view among scholars today, specialists who study the material, regardless of whether they're Christians, moderates, liberals, agnostic, atheists. Bart Ehrman, the same name we started with. Bart Ehrman says, he said, it's a fact that the earliest Christians believed they saw the risen Jesus. He said, that's a fact. He said, I'm not going to shy away from it because history shows it's true. He says, you can't deny that. He's the skeptical non-Christian. So those are examples. Now, what I thought I'd do is lay some of the groundwork for you here, and most of what I've done tonight is methodological. We haven't quite gone an hour, but that's okay. What I've tried to do is lay some methodological groundwork and say, this is how critics in the field work at this question. And then at the end, you come down to the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and Paul says some very encouraging things. He says that the resurrection is applicable to life too. It's not just something that's true. It's something that has meaning. he says, for example, because the resurrection is true, you should be steadfast in your faith. He says, don't fall away, don't walk away from your faith. Best message you ever heard, hang in there, be steadfast. Second thing he says is, because the resurrection happened, you need to work. Work for the Lord, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Very next verse, he's taking up offering for the poor. So he says you need to work. And then just 2-3 verses earlier, he says he's sort of taunting death. And he quotes the Old Testament. And he says, death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? And he says it's because of the resurrection of Jesus that we can have eternal life. So that's kind of the note on which he ends. You can believe and have eternal life. You can be steadfast. You can work. That means help others. And so Paul ends with this. I will tell you this. In over 300 verses in the New Testament, the resurrection is linked to almost every major area of theology and almost every major area of practice. So it has doctrinal implications, historical implications, practical implications. And I think Christians should follow it to the end. They shouldn't stop and say, I'm not going to help hurting people, or I'm not going to, I mean, we should be involved in working with the homeless, working with folks who aren't eating. Jesus himself said, love your neighbors yourself. And he said it's the second greatest command, by the way. Love your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbors yourself. Second greatest command. So everything else is lower than that, except love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. This is all true or not true based on the resurrection of Jesus. But it's the methodological tools in particular I'm interested in tonight. The way we do historiography is not all that incredibly different from the way we do ancient historiography. The New Testament is written close enough to the sources. I've only done some of the Christian sources tonight. If you're interested, I can talk about another group of sources outside the New Testament. I can talk to you about non-Christian sources, 18 of them, which also list the fact that Jesus claimed to be deity, did miracles, fulfilled prophecy. The fact that's reported more than any other fact is in these non-Christian sources that he died by crucifixion. 12 out of 18, exactly 2/3, argue that he died by crucifixion. There's even sources for the resurrection of Jesus in non-Christian literature. And I'll end with this last thought. In the New Testament, the doctrine that's linked to the resurrection of Jesus more than any other doctrine is the resurrection of believers. We're told almost 20 times in the New Testament that those who've trusted Christ, and that word in the Greek, pisteuo, pistis, it's a real strong word that means to commit yourself to say yes to, as in to devote your life. It's not just, yeah, I believe so-and-so won the game yesterday. It's commitment. It's to surrender, to give your life, to be devoted, to be committed. Sort of a I do, like you say in marriage. It's that kind of commitment. And Paul says that's the two sides. Jesus did these things. You make the right move. You've got the ticket to eternal life. But not in the sense of, what my pastor back home calls a get out of jail free card. It's not something you stick in your pocket and just go, someday it'll be relevant. Because Jesus said more about the present aspect of the kingdom than they said about the future aspect of the kingdom. And Christians need to be working here, helping others, right on through. It's not something that just starts later. Okay, let me stop right there. As I said, it's not quite an hour, but that's okay. I'm going to start with some questions or comments or remarks. You want me to just take these myself? Okay. Anybody? Yes.
Critic scholars, would they admit that they have a responsibility to provide an alternative explanation for these resurrection narratives or facts?
Would they
admit that they have a responsibility to provide an alternative explanation?
Critical scholars?
Yeah. Or is that just your conclusion that they should?
Well, some will take other views. A minority of scholars, actually. I did a head count a few years ago, and about 23% of scholars from a representative sample. I've got a bibliography of 3,400 sources, and about 23% of scholars try to fill in that blank. The rest of them don't.
what are the leading hypotheses among skeptics?
Naturalistic theories.
Yeah.
I'd say still the one we're dealing with is probably, and I say this is the most popular, but there's only probably, I said I have a bibliography of 3,400 sources, probably 10 people say hallucinations. 10 out of 3,400. So, but that's probably the most common view today. Now, on my website, if you want to look, GaryHabermas.com, it's Habermas, nothing's for sale there. It's just sources if you want to use them. There's debates, video, audio, articles, books. I do have an article under the articles tab on the left-hand side. It's a journal article on hallucination explanations of the resurrection. And I give a variety of critiques, 19 critiques based on different sorts of hallucination approaches. So if you want to see it, it's there. Anyone else? Yes?
So, when we have to establish some historical proof, there are many sources of documents, and you were speaking mostly about texts, but for the resurrection, perhaps the Shroud of Turin may have something to say. You consider it as a document for establishing this?
Okay, I'm missing...
He asked whether the Shroud of Turin is a viable document for these events.
The reason I'm smiling is because I've had a big conversation with people today about this topic. Yeah, I co-authored 2 books on the Shroud, and the reason I tell you that is not to talk about me, but my co-author was the original editor and spokesperson for the team that did the scientific investigation in 1978. He was a part of original carpool. He was working in a carpool with the 4 guys. They were professors at the Air Force Academy in the U.S. That's I mean, it sounds like an army or something, but it's a regular university. And there were 2 professors of physics, engineer, 2 engineers, 2 professors of physics in the car. And it was kind of like a cross section of people. 2 of them were Catholic, 1 was Protestant, 1 was agnostic. And they started putting this through there, and that led to the first set of tests in 1978. There's some more testing that's supposed to be done on the Shroud pretty briefly, like in the next year or 2. I would hope even sooner than that. And all I can tell you, I'm helping a guy get those reports published. But they're going to be testing for some pretty big things. I will tell you that it's going to be in the news again for sure after these tests, either yay or nay. I don't know that the Shroud has to be the burial garment of Jesus or not, but I do think there's something very, very provocative on the cloth. How many are familiar with what the Shroud looks like? Just a few of you? It's a cloth which wrapped the length of the body of a person who's been crucified, and the cloth wraps this way. So when you open the cloth up, it just wraps, it kind of loops around the head and starts down the back. So the bottoms of the feet are on one end and the tops of the feet are on this end, because it comes like that. There's a lot of strange things on this cloth. For example, there's dirt on the feet, which turns out to be on the feet of the man who was crucified. And it turns out to be limestone. And this limestone is a specific species of limestone that's found only in the Jerusalem Dead Sea area. In fact, this has been written up in a peer-reviewed chemical journal, secular chemical journal, about the limestone. Then there's pollens on the cloth. The Shroud has not been out of Western Europe since the 13th century, 14th century. It's been in Switzerland, France, and Italy. And yet there are pollens on the Shroud, a number of pollens. They call them prehistoric pollens because the plants on which they grew no longer lived during that time. And the plants are exclusively from the Dead Sea, Jerusalem area. Now, if you're faking a cloth like this, why do you worry about importing a cloth from the Middle East? Nobody can tell. If you're going to put a guy in there who's crucified in Western Europe, why does he have to have Palestinian dirt on his feet? Then there's a debate about this, but there look like there are coins over the eyes. And on the right eye in particular, through image enhancement, when they did these experiments, you can see through the cloth and see what's underneath with certain, I mean, they did everything. They did infrared, X-ray thermography, ultraviolet spectroscopy, all kinds of things. And they could read the lettering. Now, there is dispute about this from some of the scientists, but they're arguing about 7 letters around the top of the coin. And I usually have, when I'm doing this lecture, I usually have slides, and you can see the letters pretty clearly. But now transliterated from Greek to English, the last letters there are U-C-A-I. First of all, this is part of the name Tiberius Caesar. And these are leptons, little tiny penny-looking things. It looks bronze. Very small coins. And with being able to read the lettering, there's a staff on it. The lettering indicates a lepton of Pontius Pilate minted between 29 and 32 AD. Now, if you were in the Middle Ages trying to fake this cloth, you'd say, why do you import a cloth from Israel when nobody even knows what that would be? Why pollen from Jerusalem Dead Sea? Why dirt from Jerusalem Dead Sea? Why a lepton of Pontius Pilate? And why even put a lepton like that on the eye? Because the minute you put the cloth over it, nobody can see it anyway in the Middle Ages. So they have a lot of things like this. But the most interesting stuff is that there's several scientific results that cannot be faked. What I mean is, they can't be faked, but they can't even be duplicated. Science today cannot even make a shroud because there's some characteristics on the cloth that can't be explained. One is what's called 3D. The shroud is a 3D image, and that means the man's lying on his back, his left hand's crossed over his right hand. He's in a state of rigor mortis, this blood and serum flowing from his wounds, which means he's dead. There's also separation of blood and fluid. He's been stabbed in the heart. They can tell because, dozens of pathologists have studied this. And his left leg is popped back up. His left knee is popped up in rigor mortis. So the cloth would drape over certain high points. In other words, it'd be on the forehead, the nose, the chin, but it wouldn't be on the ear. It'd be on the chest, his arms crossed over, so it could be primarily on the left arm, a little less on the right arm, not on the rib cage. It's going to be on the left leg that's popped back up, but not on the right knee, and so on. Yet, even though the cloth didn't touch the body in several places, they can tell by the lay of the cloth and where the photography indicates on this. And whatever created the image has to jump across space of up to a few centimeters. Well, there's no process we know that can jump across space and make a clear image on cloth. You can get things from the human body like ammonia or sweat and in an excruciating death. You can have those kind of chemicals. But all they're going to do, they've done many, many experiments, all it's going to produce is a smudge on the cloth. And there are hundreds of burial garments in existence in museums around the world, hundreds of ancient cloths, and none of them have anything but decomposition, blood stains, and so on. But the shroud has a total body length, and it's an image created in areas that doesn't touch the cloth. But the strangest thing about the cloth is that where the left hand crosses the right hand with the two hands, you can see the bone structure of the hand with the cloth on top of it. So you wonder how in the world can you see the hands up here? And when you look at the face, you can see the teeth underneath the bottom lip. And not just the teeth, but the roots of the teeth. In fact, there was a dental surgeon at Duke Medical School in our country, a top 5 medical school. And he said it was the best dental x-ray he'd ever seen. And he said best because, and I've had other dental surgeons explain this to me, you got to put an apparatus in the mouth to get the picture out, and the jaws is round. So in order to put something on an x-ray that looks straight takes a pretty extraordinary effort that science has been trying to perfect with this. But the shroud image, it's like straight, it's linear. And they, we don't know how to make images like that straight. So this guy from Duke Medical, from the dental surgery, said that it was the best x-ray of his teeth he'd seen. I was doing this lecture once in our country, just a few weeks ago, and there was a dentist and the dental surgeon in the second row, and he said in order to get that close a pattern on the teeth, you'd have to put a ball inside your mouth about the size of a golf ball in order to get that to come out like that. But here's the crazy thing. With the bones in the hands and the teeth, some doctors also think they can see the backbone through the front, through the chest. In order to get that kind of effect, what you're looking at is two kinds of X-rays. X radiation and gamma radiation. The problem is the man in the shroud's dead, and whatever seems to be coming out, it backlights the bones in the teeth because it's coming out this way instead of coming in this way. And yet the body's dead, the body's in a state of rigor mortis. And it looks like, if you've seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, the body's real seriously beaten up. In fact, the shroud was one of the sources he used for that movie. So the person's really beat up, they're in a state of rigor mortis, they're dead, and you have to explain how apparently x-rays are coming out of the body. And I was asked to give a paper a few years ago on the historical aspects of the man of the shroud. How in the world could you get close to saying this was Jesus when thousands of people were crucified in the ancient world? And so I was at this conference, I got to hear other people talk. And the two folks who were, the two scientists who were the most outspoken and talking about x-rays from a dead body, one was a retired medical professor from the same school, Duke Medical School, and the other one was I believe he was the head of X-radiation division of UCLA School of Medicine. So, these weren't like pastors or people who just saying, I don't mean pastors aren't bad, just pastors shouldn't be talking about x-rays, So, it's just really extraordinary. And then I happen to have my things here. I wasn't asked to bring them, but I just threw some things on a memory stick. And I showed the slides the other night at a college in England. Everybody was just, the photographs are incredible. They're scientific, all the photos I have are scientific photos. So anyway, sorry, long answer to a question. But, and if anybody's wondering, what about the 1988 test that said it's carbon-14, that said the shroud was a medieval artifact? The latest on that is you can Google Ray Rogers of Los Alamos Lab in the U.S., University of California. He was the chief chemist on the shroud team, and before you accuse him of being religious or something, that's why he did this. He starts his article saying, "I'm sick and tired of talking about miracles. I don't want to talk about miracles. It's a bunch of bunk. I just want to talk about textiles." He said, under a microscope, he said, we're talking empirical information. He says, all I can tell you is that the shroud pieces we got in 1978 are not the same cloth as what they dated in 1988. He had cloth of both, and he gives a list of the chemical characteristics. And this was published in a peer-reviewed secular chemistry journal. And his conclusion is, whatever these two cloths were, what we dated in 78, which is imagery, actual shroud, is not the same cloth of 1988. And his conclusion is that they apparently took a patch, not the kind of obvious patch where you just kind of cut it out, you can see a square. There's those on the shroud. But there's also what you call an invisible weave. It's like when a little boy rips his, best pair of pants playing, sports, and his mom tries to match the threads and tries to do what's called an invisible weave and keep his good pants. And there's those kind of patches on the shroud too. And his guess is that what they dated in '88 in Switzerland, Oxford, and in Arizona, and 3 universities, he said that what they dated apparently was a patch that is 60% whatever the date of the cloth is and 40% medieval. He said that's what a patch. What he means by medieval is a patch. And so that's why the date was screwed up in 1988. And we'll tell you this, there was a secret dating of the shroud in 1982. I say secret because it was done at one of the most reputable labs in our country, and they got 2 dates. But I say secret because they didn't get permission before they tested it. So it's a little bit, I guess politically incorrect to do something without being asked. But they did it, and the 2 dates they got from the shroud in 1982 were 70 and 30 AD, plus or minus. So that's in contrast to the 88 date. Almost all of this, by the way, has been written up in peer-reviewed secular chemical, engineering, physics, and other journals of that nature.
His name was Ray Rogers.
Ray Rogers. Some of you with magic fingers, I know when I lecture, you folks do this too. Your prof's talking and says, I know this article is online, and before he even finishes talking, someone says, I've got it, send me your email, I'll send you all, and pretty soon everybody in class has the article. That's how fast it is to find this thing. But Ray Rogers, do you remember, Thermochemica Acta is the name of the journal. Thermochemica Acta. Ray Rogers is the author, and I think Shroud of Turin's in the title, and probably something about chemistry. But it's a 03, 04? Do you remember? You don't remember? 03, 04 article.
After the resurrection, how long did Jesus appear? For how long time after the resurrection is he supposed to have appeared?
The only reference to that is Luke saying he appeared for 40 days. And of course, Pentecost is 50 days, Penta, 50 days after the Passover. So that's when the first Christian sermon is preached. That's when Peter preaches the first sermon. But so from that, I guess you'd say Jesus was there for 40 to 50 days.
I just want to say, would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. You want me to do it again?
No.
Okay. Yes.
So you said there are other ancient biographies where they include miracles.
Yes, very, very common.
One question would be, if we don't take those miracles seriously, why should we take the gospel?
Okay, excellent question. If we don't take Greco-Roman miracles seriously in the Greco-Roman biographies, if we don't take them seriously, why should we take the New Testament miracles seriously? Okay, great question. I think you're going to have to do it according to data and how strong the evidence is. Now, to use something besides the resurrection as a jumping off point, just to give you an example. When I went to grad school in the mid-'70s, if you said Jesus was a miracle worker, you'd be an evangelical. You'd be a minority. You'd be really, really conservative. Today, virtually the entire critical community, if they're scholars, that's the only requirement. You can't be a fly-by-night kind of say whatever you want to, do your little blog and invent it and move on. If you're, terminal degree, peer-reviewed publication, etc., virtually everybody, 90%, 95%, is going to say Jesus is a miracle worker. Now, there are differences about what a miracle means. Does it have to be supernatural? Could he heal cognitively? We're finding out today with cognitive psychotherapy that cognitive methods can heal. So all you're asking is, or let's put it this way, if you ask the question, what percentage of what percentage of the claimed miracles that take place in the Gospels, what percentage come with one or more historical benchmarks that indicate that something like that happened? If you ask that question, two major studies, one by an Australian scholar, Graham Twelftree, in a book just short of 500 pages long called Jesus the Miracle Worker. He also wrote a book called Jesus the Exorcist, because it's critics now, not the conservatives. Critics put exorcisms in the same category as miracles. So Graham Twelftree does this book on the exorcism of Jesus, and he does one on the miracles of Jesus. The miracles book is almost 500 pages. And he finds 27 miracle accounts in the Gospels. 4 Gospels, I guess that's, not too many miracles per Gospel, but 27 miracles, 4 Gospels. And he argues that 21 of the 27 miracle cases have one or more historical benchmarks to say it probably happened or something like that happened. Okay, a little more skeptical scholar, John Meyer of Notre Dame University in the U.S., he did a large volume. He did a set of volumes called A Marginal Jew about Jesus. And the second volume is on miracles. It's also about 500 pages. He counts 30 instead of 27, because some of them are, is this the same miracle as this one? So you have to kind of count differently. So he comes up with a list of 30, and he's a little more skeptical than the Australian scholar, and he argues that 13 of the 30 are well evidenced by normal historical data. So 13 out of 30, 21 out of 27. So today, by far the majority of scholars believe that Jesus was a healer in some sense of that word. So if you say, well, okay, well, what about the other ancient miracle claims? Well, the problem is one of the best rules for historical criticism is you want as many sources as possible. Now for Jesus, there's New Testament sources, Christian sources outside the New Testament, and secular sources. And whatever in the world, what do you do with the Shroud of Turin or something like that? Well, right now, I don't know, it may not count for anything, but there's a number of different sources there. And so the reason they will take a more positive view, even guys who are not Christians by a mile, the reasons they take a more positive view are because they have checks and balances. They have multiple sources. With other ancient, let's say this Roman miracle, this Greek miracle, the sources are generally very, very late, and we only have one source. So if it's a miracle claim, it's hundreds of years old, and we only have one source, those are good benchmarks for, what does that help us with? So, it's a great question. How do you tell? But you look for a criteria. In fact, I'll tell you how good the New Testament material is. One of the chief historical benchmarks is what's called multiple attestation. 2 heads are better than 1. 2 sources are better than 1 source. More is super. In fact, the Jesus Seminar, as skeptical as they are, they say if you have 2 sources, 2 independent sources for one of Jesus' sayings, that makes it a lot more likely that that saying's historical. This is Jesus Seminar who reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. And yet, as the critics count it, if you're not familiar with New Testament studies, this will sound a little strange to you, but as the critics count sources, not conservatives, conservatives have come to go along with this, but critics think that there are 5 sources in the Gospels, not 5 Gospels, 5 sources. If Mark is one of them, that's one source. So if the text is Mark, that counts for Mark. If it's Mark and Matthew, that counts for Mark. If it's Mark and Luke, that's only Mark. And if it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's Mark. So if Mark's there, because it's the earliest gospel, if Mark is there, it's Mark. Okay, John is separate. It's pretty much a separate source. So if it's John, it's John. Those are 2 sources. Mark, John. But then Matthew uses another source that critics call M. M is material that's found in Matthew that's found nowhere else, that he got his material from this M source. Okay, that's the third one. Luke got material from an L source. They're not making things up and saying there's not. What they mean is there are verses in Luke that don't come from any other source. That's all it means. There's actual data that can't be traced to the other sources. And then there's a source called Q. Q means verses that are found in Matthew and Luke, but they're not in Mark. That's Q. So 5 sources. Mark, John, M, L, and Q. Miracles of Jesus are recorded in 5 out of 5 sources, with the Jesus Seminar saying 2 make something remarkable. 5 out of 5 have a miracle worker, and 2 of them are very early. So that's why critics take that so seriously. Jesus called himself the Son of Man. That's a title of deity. 5 out of 5 sources, he called himself the Son of Man. Now, you can't get better than 5 out of 5. But if you look at ancient Roman sources, you almost, I mean, I'm no expert in this, on the Roman sources, but I'm not aware of a single Roman miracle for which you have more than one source and which is very close to the date. It's typically 100, 200 years later, one source, it's supernatural. That just doesn't look like it has the earmarks of something we're going to jump on board. But if you have 5 out of 5 in the miracles, 5 out of 5 and claim to be the Son of Man, you know, and then you got the resurrection stuff that you can date very early to the people who were there. It's pretty sobering. Yes?
What if someone, for example, Paul or Peter, would have gained benefits in that Jesus would have resurrected? Like in the New Testament, they put the money back to Jerusalem. Wouldn't that be a good way for keeping people to give money? Because if they're giving money to the core, and if the core in Jerusalem have more money, then...
Well, the people they took the offering for in Jerusalem were poor people, so they were lacking food, and Christians in the early years kept things in common and divided things up, so they shared whatever the poor people needed. They shared their possessions with each other. So I guess what I'd ask is, what benefits did Peter and Paul have? Paul was pretty high in Jewish society. He was a Pharisee. He was a scholar. He was chosen to be the one to arrest men, women, and children. He was he was a scholar who could handle himself, and he would march around and take these people. He had a pretty high position. Then all of a sudden he finds himself, he's a Christian because he meets Jesus, he's whipped. He gives a list of things that happened to him. He had the 40 lashes minus 1, which is the most. 39 lashes were the most lashes a Jew could give. He was shipwrecked several times. He was stoned and left for dead outside of Lystra. Had a whole lot of things. What I mean is, what would he get back in return? Peter's a fisherman. He walked away from his business. Peter, Andrew, John, James, all fishermen. So they had a business. That means they were like middle class. They had a boat. They had a business. They walk away. They run around the countryside. They're chased. Paul, Peter, John, and who am I leaving out? Paul, Peter, John, James, the brother of Jesus. We have first century sources for the martyrdom of 3 out of those 4, and a second century source for the martyrdom of John. So they ended up giving their lives for this. I guess what I'm asking is, what could we say they gained from it?
Power?
What kind? They go from businessmen to being renegades. They're on the run, they're chased. You know something interesting? I just noticed this the other night and doing just, private reading. Paul is stoned outside the city of Lystra. In the next few verses, he comes back to Lystra 2 more times. It's a lot of guts. He goes right back to the same city where he was stoned and left for dead. That just doesn't make a lot of sense for somebody who's trying to get a easy fix. Oh, here's another one for you. Lucian, that satirist who makes fun of Christians, who wrote the book How to Write History. Lucian says, Christians are stupid. He said, if you want to make an easy living for yourself, go to the Christian communities, claim to be a prophet. They're required to put you up for 3 days at a time. They'll take you in. They'll give you a place to stay and food to drink. And after 3 days, when they see you're not producing anything, they'll ask you to leave because you're not working. So go to the next home, stay for 3 more days, eat food. He said, these guys are dummies. He said, they'll keep putting you up in their homes and keep taking care of you. And he says, the other crazy thing is they're not even afraid to die. He said, how silly is that? They're not afraid to die. This is Lucian making fun of early Christians. So he's saying that Christians can be taken advantage of because they give their money away, and they'll open their home to people. And that's interesting that Lucian says that, because that's exactly what the book of Acts says. I mean, I'm not saying you can't think of anything. It's just not any obvious benefits of running around and letting people chase you and beat you up and not having your business to go back to. And what do you think?
Well, I wasn't there, so.
Okay. All right. Anyone else?
What about other religious sources? Like if you would compare the sources from Jesus and, for example,
Like Buddha?
like Buddha or...
Okay, I used the Buddha example today, so let me...
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of that. How about picking another religious leader like Buddha or Muhammad and say, what kind of sources do we have? I'm not a scholar in either one, I'll let you know that, even though like I told you, I came pretty close to converting to Buddhism. It wasn't the classic kind, it was a kind of a weird hybrid. But I've got a book on my shelf at home. It's called The Buddhist Scriptures. And the guy's got a PhD, and he's a Buddhist. And he says there are more holy books in Buddhism than any other religion. He says you could put all the holy books together, we'd have 300 large volumes. He said, so unfortunately, a lot of our best sources don't get read. He said, so I'm putting this little book together with some of the major Buddhist readings. And so he starts the book like this. He says, for my Christian readers, just a caution. He said, we're not like you guys. He said, you guys have the words of your Lord. We don't. You have the words of the people who studied under your Lord. We don't. You have the words who studied under the guys who studied under your Lord. We don't. We don't have those kind of sources. He says our earliest sources are 300 to 500 years after the Buddha lived. He said that's not early enough to tell anything for sure historically. And then so you flip a few chapters ahead, and the chapter's called The Words of Buddha. And when you get there, he says, now let me remind you again, we don't have Buddha's words. But this is what people say Buddha may have taught. So, I mean, that's a pretty stark comparison. I'm not trying to make fun or say anybody. This is a Buddhist scholar. This is not somebody going off on Buddhism. This is a Buddhist scholar. And he says, we just don't have that kind of material. Is that it? Okay. Thanks. This one, right?